Welcome to HR.com Live. This podcast is produced by HR.com, the #1 destination to help 1.7 million HR executives maximize human potential and drive extraordinary business results.
Good afternoon and welcome to HR.com Live. My name is Dr. Heidi Scott and I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at HR.com. And I have the privilege of getting to equip our learning ecosystem so that it remains innovative and we're able to help HR professionals with the tools they need to learn, lead, and navigate their careers. I'll be your host for today, and in this episode, we're going to be talking with Ash Seddeek about the habits of highly effective strategic leaders and how HR leaders can lead the way. I don't know about you, but that's a topic I would love to learn about. So, Ash, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and a little bit about Ash. He's a business strategist and leadership coach and keynote speaker. And he works with executives to advance their leadership impact through communications, messaging, goal setting, and storytelling. He currently works with leaders at Sprinklr, Cisco, Uber, Lyft, Cupertino Electric, and San Francisco Health Plan. As a best-selling author and speaker, Ash writes and talks about leaders as chief excitement officers. And he's also involved as a leadership mentor with Women Unlimited. So quite a diverse background, and thank you, Ash, for being here. And I think that you and I share a commonality of possibly being learning leader junkies.
Yes, that's correct.
So let's talk about the new HR leader today. And you know, we see the need for what I would call the new HR leader being an integral part of strategic boardroom conversations. So tell us a little bit about what and how you see this presence impacting organizations.
It's very important, of course, given a lot of the challenges that are happening. You know, we've had a talent shortage for a long while with the economy the way it has been going, and I know that the environment is changing slightly right now. But in general, for the most part, companies are experiencing the war on talent, and the question then becomes, how do we do such a great job keeping the talent we have, and then also how do we position ourselves in a way that attracts talent? And I think those two dimensions bring a requirement on our HR leaders to really be able to have the conversation about, how do I help you retain your existing talent? What are all the different things that I can work with you to do? And then also, what are some strategic activities that we can think of that will potentially help define our culture, define our values, so we become a recognized employer. Other people start thinking of us, looking at us, and coming over to us. Otherwise, it's very costly for us to spend money on talent acquisition if we are not a well-known brand name, or if we're not doing any outreach that's very strategic in nature, like partnerships with universities, partnerships with other institutions that might help sort of bring up the attention to the organization. So the dynamic of just addressing HR requests coming in by themselves is fine, but we need to go beyond being on the receiving end of a request and really sort of get ahead into that conversation and scheduling time with executives and talk about some of these strategic issues.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. We've heard it for years. We've got to get a seat at the table. And yet I'm looking forward to, I know you've got some tangible like steps, some tangible how-to. How do we go about doing that? So just kind of lead us in that direction. When it comes to strategic leaders, what are the typical approaches and mindsets that you see?
I see, and that's really based on my work with HR leaders as well as leaders of who basically lead business lines in large companies. I've discovered that one of the key mindsets that I talk about is this whole idea of becoming a chief excitement officer. And
I love that term, by the way. I just gotta say.
Yeah, thank you. And it's because really people love the energy we bring. Right? So when Heidi is running a team, or Ash is running a team, or anyone who's listening is running a team, people realize that there is definitely the day-to-day grind. We know that it's there. But we want someone to come and be able to tell us about what tomorrow looks like. So I usually tell leaders that we can talk about the what is, that's what's happening right now. We can start talking about what if, just imagining, what if we're able to actually take a business process and improve it? But the one that's really more exciting and brings smiles to our faces is what when. What when that thing that we're talking about actually does happen. And we usually use, when I do this is a program with leaders in the room, 2-day experience talking about strategic leadership. The very first day we start thinking about making a trip out to a lake here in California, uh, called Yosemite. And we basically say, what would it be like when we, number one, start planning to go to Yosemite? And they start talking about all the different ways that we need to think about planning, depending who's going, how far it is, what transportation we're going to do. And then we start talking about what is the experience going to be like. Are we looking for a 5-star experience, a tent experience? What exactly are we thinking about? And then we start talking about that moment when we all stand in front of a waterfall and we forget everything that happened to get there, but we are enjoying that moment of really finally getting to our destination. So chief excitement officers are people who are able to identify opportunities for taking the organization from where it is to a much higher level. We're not necessarily talking about 5x, 10x. We're really trying to think more about disruptive, innovative, different points of view for how we can achieve a delta of improvement in the business. And with that in mind, then you're walking around the organization telling people, this is what it's going to look like. This is how that waterfall is going to look like, the fresh air in our faces, how the kids are going to be playing around. We're going to have a fantastic time. It's going to be amazing. That excitement, of course, we need to qualify it, because there are a lot of people listening to us will be thinking about, it could be risky. Somebody can trip up, and so we need to, have 911 handy. Yes, we definitely need to be thinking about all the different risks, but the organization needs some people who are willing to be excited and willing to take the risk of being excited. And of course, then we need to bring in our colleagues who are really helping us as co-pilots say, hey, you're thinking about the rosy picture. Let's think about the downside. How can we also minimize the downside by thinking through all of those scenarios? So we come back and say, fundamentally, we just need more of the chief excitement officer mindset, because all the other mindsets are potentially in high supply, whereas the one that's very energetic and the one that's not really, sucked into the daily grind is the one we want. Because you know what? The daily grind is not going to go away. We just need someone to talk about what that future looks like. And a GE executive one time said, we love people at GE who could go into the future and then come back and tell everybody about it. And I think that is a huge mental shift for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that inspiring aspect of being a leader who can lead with inspiration that equates, a byproduct is excitement. I think, and you talked about this just a few minutes ago, getting that seat at the table. And if you don't have the seat at the table, when I say the table, at the executive level, finding someone to connect with at that level, having those conversations and making sure that we really understand the goals and trajectory of the organization, because it will do us no good to be all excited and spin up a great vision of something that's headed in the wrong direction.
Absolutely.
I think that's a nice precursor for all of us to keep in mind. Like we have to know where our organization's going. What are those annual goals and objectives that we're after? And it's interesting. I published a book chapter. It's been quite some years ago, and it centers on what I call vision storylines, which sounds very similar as you were describing it. It's
yes.
like taking that picture and making that vision, that destination come to life. And I agree with you that times there are people that will be like, what are you?
Exactly.
And yet, as we continue to cascade and share that vision, I think it really brings great meaning to people who, as you mentioned, they're in the trenches, they have the daily grind, but it brings meaning and reality of, yeah, I'm doing these, what might feel like daily grind tasks. We all have them, but I also know how it's contributing to helping us get to that desired destination.
Exactly.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. You brought a great point. Yeah. So I think, definitely your point. I think definitely thinking about becoming a chief excitement officer in light of where we're going. And also there is another element to it, which is sometimes the excitement that you find as a leader could be contrary to conventional thinking. And we want people listening to also think about, how do I develop the muscle to go back and say, I know we're thinking of doing X, Y, and Z. Here's a very unconventional way of thinking about it, and be able to actually have those conversations. That's part of developing that strategic muscle, because there will always be people who, as you said, who will basically sort of question, what are you thinking? And if you have a strong belief in the validity of your idea, work within the organization, build a coalition of people that will support you on that and explain what the business case is. And that kind of brings us to the next mindset. And the next mindset is adopting a mindset of someone who is a management consultant. And when we bring this up, we basically bring it up because a management consultant is usually looked at as someone, the very first thing that comes to our mind is someone that actually has industry knowledge. Someone who has, let's say, worked in financial services for 20 years, now is a consultant, worked in healthcare for 20 years, now is a consultant, or high tech and so forth. And the reason being because we look at these individuals as people who can go and look across the industry, take a look at all the different players and what they are doing, and pick up a few nuggets, and then come back and say, let me just share with you what I saw on that landscape. Here's what ABC company is doing, XYZ company is doing. And by the way, when I look at how we're doing it, I see an opportunity for us to, at very least, level set with the industry. And for a lot of people, and we've seen it, you've seen it, I've seen it, a lot of us, once we get in the building, we actually forget that there is a huge world that exists outside that building. And what we want to tell our HR leaders is definitely keep an eye out on what's happening in other um, industry participant companies. Reach out to some of the executives in those companies and say, I'd love to speak for 15, 20 minutes. Here's what I'm doing. I'm really trying to gather information about this and this. I want to see how you're doing this, how you're doing that. And we're talking about the value of conferences. I think it definitely behooves us to continue interacting with professionals, whether virtually or in person, to uncover what other people are doing. So that's really what that mindset is about. Because if I go into the room with a few new ideas, that the person I'm going to speak with would be delightfully, surprised by the fact that I've done some extra homework, which is, again, for a lot of people, they're not expecting it.
Yeah.
They are expecting you to come in and talk about the daily grind. But then you say, you know what, I actually took a few minutes over the past few weeks and I looked at X, Y, and Z, and I want to share with you. So that's what this mindset is about. And I think it's very valuable for a strategic thinker to have.
Yeah. I love all that. Share with us, I think you've got some like tangible, like some, I don't say how-tos, but when it comes to the intricacies of being an effective strategic leader, what are those regular disciplines and habits that you find effective strategic leaders possess?
Absolutely. And I've actually made sure that I get them down here on paper for us to make sure we cover them in a way that's sequential for our audience. But the very first one I want to share with them is, I actually talk about those 7 habits of highly effective strategic leaders. And the very first one is really making sure that they take time to reflect. And that reflection will get them thinking about what that outside world has, what we've done in the past, where we are today, and where we want to be, very much, as you said, sort of aligning to where the company wants to go. Then doing that reference check across the industry, and then coming back and sharing with their teams and audiences, here's what I see us not thinking about. Because again, you talk to anybody and they will tell you, I am on back-to-back calls. So the folks that take time off, even if it's 15 minutes a day, and shut everything off and go and sit at a coffee shop or wherever they get that the thought process to be kicked in, that time to reflect is incredibly important, because maybe in those moments they realize, oh my goodness, we actually talked about ABC 6 months ago and we completely forgot about it. Even bringing something important that we talked about back to the forefront, everybody was like, oh my God, thank you so much, because we had such high hopes for this. And then of course we got sucked into the tunnel, and you are now grabbing us back to remind us that we need this diversity and inclusion initiative, or we need this resource group to be inside the organization, or do we need to reach out to the universities? Again, because the strategic agenda, what I see happening, the strategic agenda does exist for the most part. What ends up happening is people walk away from that strategic meeting and they completely forget the bridge between that offsite and what needs to happen afterwards. I think there are some organizations that have a very strong muscle there, but I think the balance of organizations, once they walk out of that meeting, they look at their agenda, they have the back-to-back calls, and then they forget about, oh, we've got this list of 10 things that we want to achieve.
So it
So
sounds like
that's
you're
the
saying
essential
habit
one.
number one would be the time, creating the time and space to have some personal reflection at an
Absolutely.
individual level, regardless of what our organizations provide for us or demand from us. Like I'm hearing you say, hey, that's a discipline we need to exercise.
Absolutely, and I share with leaders that I work with that we really look at this as meeting with self, MWS, and the meeting with self for some people that may be a Friday afternoon meeting, and we actually start thinking about what's on that agenda. Well, number one, the very first thing, of course, is just gotta check in with yourself. How are you doing? Have you been taking care of you? That's number one. Have you been taking care of others? That's number two, because if you don't take care of you, you can't take care of others. And then we start going down that list of, what have you promised the team? What's on the strategic agenda? Are you managing to the strategic agenda or not? And that really becomes a very valuable meeting to have with oneself. And so that's what we want people to walk away with, the fact that, you got to honor that meeting. Just consider it a meeting with the CEO of your life, and that's you, because if you don't have that meeting with you, you're essentially going to be going with the flow rather than actually directing the flow.
Right.
And that's what your leadership is expecting from the strategic leaders, is for them to actually steer the direction and say, wait a second, I know you're going there and you spend so much time, but you know what? It doesn't really map out to the strategic direction. And I love that you mentioned that early on, is there has to be that North Star where the organization is going. And we start looking at vision 1, vision 2, vision 3 in terms of the iterations that we need to be thinking about. How much do we want to achieve and how soon? So then we start looking at the second strategic leadership habit of creating tension. And I've actually discovered this when I was working on an engagement with Cisco innovation teams on really coming up with innovations. And I found that a lot of those teams, usually they look at a problem and they see the problem, let's say in the accounting department. But the question that we had for them was, well, how endemic is this problem? Does this exist in other places within the organization? Well, how big is the issue? That's what I mean by creating tension, where you really need to, number one, develop the muscle to identify problems that exist in the business that are standing in the way of the business going to the next level of its evolution. And then how can you then, again, walk around the organization explaining what it is and really getting people to buy in the argument that we need to do something about it. So that really becomes that second very valuable skill to have of being that person, which is really kind of tied to the whole idea of chief excitement officer, to be able to say, you know what, I see something wrong here that needs to be fixed. And of course, with that comes our desire to also pay attention to the fact that everything we're talking about is going to create change. So this sort of, puts the responsibility again on us to think through the change management aspect. How are we going to manage change and lead change and execute it? And then we
Maybe at
start.
its simplest form, Ash, I'm just even thinking for our listeners who are thinking, I'm not an OD change management special. That's not my gig.
Yeah,
I think one of the things you just mentioned, when we're talking about making this tangible and concrete as a leader, as an HR professional, moving into becoming a strategic leader, we have to at least be aware that there is a change process, whether or not we take the time to slow up and think, how are we going to manage this process? There is one. Either we're going to manage it well, or it's going to manage the change. But I think at
absolutely.
its simplest level, I agree with what you're saying. Take time to reflect. Second step, create the tension and be aware that change does exist with the process, so we can better come at it with the management plan. So what's the third habit?
So the third one really kind of brings us back to an important strategic concept, which is something that I have also spoke about in a book that I co-wrote with Leslie Rubin, my co-author, is this whole idea of meaning, which you also alluded to in the beginning. Meaning is essentially the fact that we realize that people within companies, they want to understand the why. and for you to be conscious of what the why is. And sometimes, we go into different levels of explaining what the why is. And I love when we go all the way out of the company's buildings and we go out of that construct of a company and we start actually thinking about our end customers and sometimes their own end customers. And we start thinking about a mom walking into a hospital lobby with her kid and the experience that's happening in that lobby of the nurse coming over, receiving the young lady with her daughter or her son and helping her and really comforting her that the doctor will see her son in a few minutes. Looking at those experiences is part of us remembering why are we doing what we're doing. So when we talk about creating meaning, people want to understand where we've been, where they are, and where they are going. So it's all about, as you said, sort of continuing to communicate the direction and continue to explain the purpose behind what we're doing. Yes, we're a company and we're trying to make certain revenue numbers, but at the same time, also we want to make sure that we remember the bigger picture for how our work really contributes to the world. And a lot of our employees today, millennials and otherwise, they want to be part of that equation. They want to feel that their work is connecting to a higher purpose.
Yeah, so your third step there, create meaning, actually does a nice tie-in to support managing change, coming at it from reminding people continuously the why of
Yes,
what we're doing. So great. What's number
absolutely.
four?
So we'll go to number 4, and again, it's going to be interesting because again, this is based on really going through it because I have a number of startup activities where I'm investing and supporting startup teams where this idea of becoming relentlessly impatient. And it's because as leaders, sometimes we don't realize it, but our whole being, very much like that conversation about Yosemite, we want to be standing in front of the waterfall like yesterday. And that's what happens to us when we visualize the end game. When we stand in front of the waterfalls in our own mind, we visualize it, we actually start seeing it. And then the body and the whole being wants to get there as soon as possible. Now, everybody else has not been through that thought process. They haven't really visualized the waterfall. So we need to sort of step back and make sure, as you said, sort of think about the change management aspect, communicating the meaning, but we also want to manage the execution and explain to people the urgency of what we need to do, because we can take 2 years to get to Yosemite, or we can take 3 months, or we can take 2 hours. We need to be aware of how fast do we want to go. And I think leaders need to have almost like a bifocal thought process about being relentlessly impatient is, one, yes, bear in mind the change management aspect, but also be able to communicate the urgency and then have the um, OKRs, the objectives and key results that will help everybody achieve where we're going to go. And then we need to have the check-ins on a regular basis to ensure that progress. So
Right.
being relentlessly impatient is beautiful, important, and I think sometimes we resist the temptation to go after it, but it's one of those strategic values, the strategic behaviors that I'm talking about, because if we don't do it, as you said, somebody's going to say, well, how come we're not there yet?
Yeah.
Because again, other leaders have kind of saw those waterfalls and they want to see the results coming through.
Yeah. Thank you. So, how about 5? You said you got 7. So what's number 5?
Yes. So 5 is about the whole idea of communicating, which kind of ties to the change management piece, because communication is one of those things that trip us up. A lot of companies do a fantastic job now with new collaboration tools, videos, the WebExes, the Zooms of the world. All of these tools are making it possible for us to communicate. But the hard work is actually to create the communication message. And when I work with leaders, we actually start thinking about, well, how do you actually frame what you want to say? How do you say it in a way that acknowledges the fact that these people have worked so hard to get here? Well, number 1, we have to start with recognition. And then number 2, start talking about what's our next destination. Because again, one of the things that we talked about at Uber, where I was working with one of the leaders there, I basically said to people in the room, your employees want to feel that we're going somewhere. They want to feel there's a tomorrow. Yes, today's processes may be hard and difficult, but tomorrow has to have some kind of a promise that this process is going to be much better, that whatever is taking 15 days will take less, that there will be promotions, that will be growth on the job. So that whole idea of uh, feeling this whole growth aspect happening around us, within the business, within us, is very, very critical. And that's really where you need to continue communicating. You need to build alliances, create networks, because as we said in the very beginning of the top of the conversation, you're creating change, you're leading it. You might as well make sure that there are conditions for success. And I'll go and kind of share 6 and 7 so that we can wrap things up for people. Number 6 is about building capacity, which is this whole idea of really helping people develop and grow. And this really came from Naidu Kubain, the president of High Point University, one of the folks we interviewed for the Meaning book. And the last one is to get out of the way so others can do what they want to do. Because a lot of the time as leaders, sometimes again, because we are so excited about the vision, we want to be part of everything. But our followers and our teams want us to essentially point where the direction is. And sometimes they want to be the proud ones who go and make it happen. And you need to be aware of the fact, aware to the fact that they actually want you to make you proud. So you may sometimes say, in some cases, you know what, I'm going to step aside, because otherwise I might actually bottleneck things. And that's what we've seen in one case with one leader at Cisco, where he realized that with a lot of projects, very high value initiatives, he was actually finding out that because he's a decision point in the chain, and sometimes it doesn't get to it fast enough, he was essentially creating that situation where the people come to him and it's slowing things down. And once he realized that what I need to do is say to them, I trust you, you guys can do this. Oh my God, what a feeling for people to walk out of that meeting saying, he just said to me that he trusts me, or she said to me, she trusts me. You know what? It actually raises the stakes now, because now I need to live up to that expectations. And number 2, of course, I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to get done.
Yeah.
And I think that's what leaders need to understand. I think HR leaders have the ability to work with leaders to explain to them that concept, because otherwise there is that tension in them. They want to be part of the action. But in order for us to build capacity, we need to get out of the action and let somebody else go through it.
No, I love what you said, and I totally agree with you that getting out of the way may seem a little counterintuitive as we're talking about habits of effective strategic leaders. But I think, as you said, empowering those who work with us, and maybe you're here listening and you know what, you're not in a leadership position yet, but you want to be. So it's a matter of even having that mindset, that heart set of equipping others, trusting others. And I think that gets to a fine line, which I know you have a whole lot of information around, the difference between being a manager and being a leader. Where that manager, I always think of like the thumb pressing down and managing and micromanaging, and who wants to work under that? Not me, not many.
Yes,
but that
exactly.
leader has much more of that open palm, like I'm going to elevate you and highlight your skills and turn you loose. And I know, Ash, I've seen some pretty amazing work. I've seen work out of those on my team that I never would have built or come up with or created or designed or even
thought was possible.
yeah, because I just said, here's where we're trying to go. You all figure out how we're going to get there, what the plan is, or whatever the project may have been. But I think that's really an exciting time for all of us. None of us have arrived as leaders and a strategic leader. And so really looking at what are some of those ways so that we can grow. So thank you so much for sharing those 7 aspects with us. I love that you're a learning nerd like me. And so for all of our listeners, what's a book on your shelf or 2 that you've been reading or that you think the rest of us probably ought to be mindful of or might be interested in?
Absolutely. So I've been actually reading this book. It says It Takes More Than Casual Fridays and Free Coffee by Diane Adams. And it's a book about helping organizations create cultures that work for everyone. And then now people are talking about inclusion, they're talking about diversity, and they're also talking about the sense of belonging. And Diane does a great job of explaining, the good and the bad and the ugly, and explaining how you can go about creating organizational cultures. So that's a great book that really kind of gets into the detail. And then the second book is a book about what we were talking about earlier, this whole idea of OKRs, Measure What Matters by John Doerr. he introduced the concept based on his work at Intel with Andy Grove, and then eventually made that available for the Google startup team. And I do believe, as we were talking about, how a lot of organizations create these offsites, they do the planning, they step out, they go Monday morning, somehow they forgot what happened over the weekend or last week. So what we need to do for organizations, or hope organizations do, is create that bridge, the execution muscle and the follow through. So those are the two books that I have been looking at, again, based on my work working with leaders, helping them think about the culture that they have, sometimes the microculture around them, and then how are they, in addition to creating the vision, how they are thinking about the execution aspect of things.
Yes, no, I love that. I think that the Measure What Matters books, we actually are, we live OKRs every day of the week. And so that alignment is important. So if you're sitting here and you're listening thinking, I don't even know what an OKR, well, what? Objectives and key results, I think that can really be helpful as a strategic leader. Even if your organization uses a different system, it'll allow you to take that visionary aspect that Ash spoke about and put some legs on it of how do we have those recurring conversations? What are we measuring that's moving us and our team, ourselves, toward the destination that our company is heading.
Mm-hmm.
So well, thank you, Ash, so much for taking the time to share your experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
Insights with us. And thank you everyone for listening and watching. Don't forget to check out our archived episodes on HR.com. We release new episodes every day, so you can stay up to date on all things HR. Have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to HR.com Live. We have new episodes daily to help you maximize your potential. Be sure to check out our archives on HR.com and share it with your friends. Cheers.